countries in the European Union benefited directly from trapping many of the poorest countries in the world into becoming agrarian societies through colonialism. And then, not only did they do that in the first instance, they made it impossible for those countries to develop in the way that they ought to have been able to by forming a cartel and raising up barriers, and stop them from being able to exercise their comparative advantage in agriculture by selling those products to European consumers who would have paid a much higher rate for them. We think that we're going to make up for that injustice, and that is going to be the most important thing in the ground. Firstly, on setup. The first thing I would note here is that I think, not to be very high school about this, but I think we would probably phase this policy in gradually, probably be about 5 years. We would lower the barriers to trade successfully in each year, and obviously we would announce that we are doing this so other countries would be able to prepare and adjust their policies accordingly. The second thing is that obviously we would be happy to stand for a world of complete free trade and deregulation of the agricultural sector in the European Union. We anticipate that this will lead many European farmers to fail. I'm going to explain why that is unimportant. But what this is really, really important for is that the countries that are most proximate to the European Union, and therefore most likely to have been the victims of colonialism, are also the ones that by virtue of that proximity now get to benefit, because the most proximate ones will be the most able to now export their products into the European Union. So what is really nice here is that the likely harm that was done to them by the European Union scales quite nicely with the benefit they will now receive. The second thing that I would note is that this is not an active debate, and there is no reason to care about the European Union or about the welfare of European farmers, and I'm going to explain why you shouldn't care about them. And the last thing I would note is that this is going to free up a huge amount of money, because a lot of that money is being used in things like these R&D programs and on subsidies in particular. And what we would do with that money is create a dedicated welfare program for people who are no longer able to viably practice farming in the European Union. Obviously, we'd do things like require financial statements to be submitted and do a market study and stuff like that to make sure that this is reasonable. But the second thing that we would do is we'd be able to extend that onwards to the foreseeable future, and we would be able to direct those farmers and their families and their children to things like retraining programs. And the last thing I would note is that university in the European Union is broadly free, and so are many other forms of tertiary qualification, which means that people in these contexts are very able to access retraining. What I would note is that I think that immediately should make you question any claims that we get from opposition side on why this is going to lead to huge amounts of backlash, protests, people leaving the EU, etc. And that previous attempts to reform farm funding in the EU have not been paired with these forms of subsidies or recompense, which is why farmers in those cases got extremely angry. But most people would probably rather be able to do something like that is not farming, because it is a very difficult job and it requires you to be isolated and so on and so forth. So we think people would probably be quite happy with the program that we are creating, which is unprecedented and different from anything in the past. Let's talk then about the weighing and why we ought to care more about developing world countries, and in particular farmers in the developing world, than we ought to care about the European Union. What I would note here is that key countries in the European Union obviously directly engaged in colonialism. And the second thing that I would note is that they engendered things like famines and starvations in those countries by forcing them to produce food but not allowing them to consume it, taking it forcibly and bringing it back to the European Union for the benefit of European people. The second thing that I would say is that practice has tracked those countries into economies that are extremely agrarian when they otherwise would not have been. This looks like Europeans taking people from one part of the country and forcing them onto farms and forcing them to work when they otherwise would not have. So it altered population distribution. It looks like Europeans coming in and artificially pushing resources into agriculture or directing those resources into agriculture when they otherwise would not have been, which meant that in many instances the natural trajectory of these countries was distorted and it forced them into agricultural practices. Now that is kind of locked in. You have large numbers of people in these countries who are experienced at farming, whose families have now done it for a while, and who, because of the effects of colonialism and poverty, find it very difficult to leave those areas and move to other places. What is important here, though, is that does mean that these countries have an asset, and that is their agricultural industry. And I would suggest that the countries that have been the biggest victims of colonialism are the ones where this effect is the strongest, and these are the ones that will benefit as a result the most from our policy when they are able to sell to the European Union. And the last thing I would say is that this effect is also ongoing. So obviously Europeans did lots of bad shit in the past, but the problem is that they're doing it in the present as well, and this injustice is being carried forward. Because when European Union countries use international organizations and the World Trade Organization to reduce barriers to trade in every other area, but make them very high in agriculture specifically, that has an asymmetric effect of fucking over those countries and meaning that their specific advantage, which is agriculture, is one that they cannot use to develop when every other country can use different industries to develop very effectively, because other barriers to trade have been brought down through things like the World Trade Organization. And the last thing that I would note about this is that every single year at World Trade Organization rounds and other similar negotiations, the most poor, the most developing countries advocate every year to get rid of trade barriers in the West and in developing countries when it comes to agriculture, because they know that that is their most viable path forwards to development. And those European and Western countries refuse to do it, which is unbelievably selfish. And they do it for things like silly domestic political concerns and not wanting to attract backlash. That is not fair, and we do not think it should be allowed to continue onwards. The last thing I would say about this is that, again, the obligation and the benefit received scales. The countries that are closest to the European Union were often subject to the earliest forms of colonialism and the worst. They are now the ones that, by virtue of that proximity, can develop and sell the most. The countries that were forced into the most aggressively and hard to break out of agricultural societies are now the ones that also benefit the most. So this is I think, an extremely fair and correct way of repaying that harm that has been done and making sure that these countries can now get some benefits. This is the biggest principal benefit in the debate. It is extraordinarily important, and it will win us this round. The last thing I'll do is take a point from closing.
Sure. Noting that you say the EU has free universities, strong welfare, and high social mobility, people didn't want to farm. Why do they farm?
Because the government distorts the economy by doing things like subsidizing people, which makes it pretty viable for them to do so. And obviously there are a few people who have a preference, or maybe they've done it for generations. But what is important here is that I think enough of those people are doing it because they can, but when they're given the alternative of generous social welfare through the unique program that we described, they will now have more agency to choose to do other things. And if they still like that lifestyle, they can do things like convert their farms into lovely hotels or Airbnbs, many other things that they could probably do. Let's talk about why this is incredibly important for the developing world. And what I want to start here with is just to note that some countries will respond to this extremely well and be prepared and make lots of money, and others maybe won't. But what is really important to note before we even get into why it's likely that this will be materially beneficial is that fundamentally this hands sovereignty that has been taken away back, because those developing countries don't have the choice right now to use their comparative advantage by selling to rich people in the European Union. They're stuck selling in domestic markets which are poor and where people can pay less, or to neighboring countries which are poor and where people can pay less. When we get rid of these barriers, that means people have more freedom to choose to sell to the EU. And so even if these countries do it poorly, we think that they will likely correct those mistakes into the future and begin to do it well. But even if they do it poorly, we still defend their freedom to do so, and think that that's the most important thing. Obviously, selling the same product to a rich person means you can make more money. These countries are likely to be able to respond to these changes in dynamics well, because this is phased in gradually, and they already have things like socialist policies and market controls, which means that they're likely to preempt any sort of changes in terms of food distribution. Extremely proud to govern.
Barriers that restrict Europeans buying food from the developing world is the thing that stops the once again repeated crime of European countries making states that don't want to be agrarian economies. It is the thing that stops the repetition of the crime, which is the food of those countries being taken away and only consumed in Europe, causing huge global food instability. Three things in this speech. First of all, a note of setup. Second of all, explaining why this is good for food stability in Europe. And third of all, explaining why this is good for global food security. Firstly, set up some characterization of what the common agricultural policy looks like. I think it's generally outlined pretty well in the info slide, but a few added things to note. First of all, the subsidization primarily is targeted at unstable kind of farms that are maybe close to collapse, and they can access this from a pool of money that's pretty able to be tapped into whenever necessary. It's not as if they're constantly being given a bunch of money even if they don't need it. Second of all, there's quite a large bias towards the research and development of new farming equipment and new crops, just to kind of push the industry forward, whether this be machinery or whether this be like the quality of the crop that we're talking about. Finally, there is, as noted in the info slide, a level of a quota to the amount of things you can buy outside of the European Union. First argument then, explaining why the common agricultural policy ensures European food stability. The first thing to explain here is that many European states and regions are just food unstable. The reasons for this are pretty simple. First of all, not every country and every person in Europe is incredibly rich. Some areas are poorer than others, and this means they don't actually have access to food that they can purchase in the absence of a subsidy. Second of all, these regions might be regionally isolated, so if individual farms fail because of a bad harvest or a lack of a subsidy, they have limited options to replace that food inflow because they're kind of regionally isolated. Third of all, a lot of these regions are subject to environmental shocks, such as surprise increases in temperatures or surprise decreases in water, which means the yield of crop can decrease significantly, which explains why you need to artificially increase the amount of farms there are in the region to make sure that if one of them fails or one of those kinds of crops fails, there is an inflow of food of food for years to come. Second of all, how do we fix this? First of all, we ensure that there are local producers that can actually provide food to these regions. The reason importers don't work here is because a lot of the time food is perishable, so it's quite difficult to local the food out there. But second of all, we provide them with better equipment and machinery, which means it's just less likely that this food production fails, which just means that the food is more secure in this region. But third of all, we explain that we invest a lot of money into genetically modified crops, which is hugely beneficial because it's more resistant to disease, it's more resistant to drought, that kind of thing. The result of this is that means there is far more access to food for a lot of poor European states that otherwise wouldn't have it. Third of all, let's explain why local supplies are necessary and replacing them with international markets is insufficient. First of all, this enables market competition. And the thing that I need you to know is that it's not as if in the rest of the world, it's just a bunch of individual farmers with their individual bits of farmland that are selling all the food. It is incredibly large multinational corporations, and the intuition for this is pretty simple. Companies like making money all year round, but they're bound by regional crop cycles because temperatures change. So they have to hedge their bets and have a bunch of farms in a bunch of places, which explains why farming corporations are very large. What this means is that in the absence of this subsidy, instead of buying from many local producers in Europe who can compete, you're subject to buying from large transnational corporations who can scalp you and jack up the price. Second of all, we ensure that there's a stability of crop because there are more farmers. And third of all, we provide jobs for critical amounts of people in Europe. And don't let OG shrug this off, because first of all, it's not just individual farmers who lose their jobs. There are countries and regions in Europe that are entirely centered around the production of food that will collapse at the basis of this opening government. It means, first of all, it is way harder for these people to reskill because, the economy is based around agriculture. 5 years is nowhere near enough for everyone to just create a new industry and get university educated. But second of all, it's really bad for the EU as a structure because now all of these smaller countries now no longer trust the richer ones. Because no, it is the smaller and poorer countries that do the agricultural production. And when they get fucked over by the rich ones, they're way less likely to cooperate with things like sanctions in the future. This is bad on a geopolitical level as well. The result of this is people lose their jobs and economies collapse. That is awful for them and is awful for food security. The final thing to note is that why we need an overarching policy. This is just preempting any analysis about individual subsidies that this government benefit one. The reason is because farming is a long-term investment, which means you need the stability of a long-term policy. Because you plant crops 1 year and they grow for a while, which means you can't just have spot investment. But second of all, the alternative is politically unviable. It's very difficult to mobilize large amounts of money to get funding for crops when it's way better instead to just have one overarching policy. The final, as a result of this, we just get way better economies in Europe and way better food production. Before I move on, closing.
Oh yeah, can't you just if there's a shock to a certain crop in Europe, you can import that from elsewhere?
Oh no, but first of all, the economies of those regions collapse. Second of all, a lot of those places are regionally isolated. And third of all, it takes a long time to log food from point A to point B in the absence of pre-established supply chains. Because food is perishable, so you need a lot of infrastructure already built up. That defeats that POI. Second claim explaining why the common agricultural policy ensures global food security. This is very important. The first thing to explain is that the common agricultural policy, and specifically its quotas, ensures food is not stolen from the people of the developing world. The main intuition here is that if a mass amount of quotas were lifted, there would be an increase in demand from Europe for food produced in the developing world. Because I don't know, first of all, maybe you don't want that cheaper food, and second of all, maybe you want different fruits which are more seasonal. The reason this causes deprivation is because now there is less food for the people who live in the place it is bought from. The reason for this is pretty simple. First of all, the agricultural companies that operate within these countries are not the individual farmers as I characterized before, but the large MNCs that are profit driven. So the second they can get a better deal by selling to Europe, they buy all of the land or use all of the land they have access to and just sell those crops to Europe, but the alternative would be they have to sell to a local market because there is no international market. What this means is that now the people who live in these countries either one, don't have food to buy and starve, or two, have to pay way higher prices and compete with Europeans in order to be able to get the food that their own country is producing. The result of this, and finally, the reason Europeans can buy a lot and thus deprive literally the rest of the world is because they care a lot about the quality of individual pieces of fruit. So if one of them looks a little bit wonky or is a little bit old, they chuck it out, which explains they can buy way more than they can consume, thus causing global deprivation, which is very bad. The result of this is that in the short term, countries shift their demand base and companies shift their demand base from the regions that they operate in to Europe and people starve. It means second of all, in the long term, these large MNCs have the money and incentive to buy up more and more agricultural land, depriving these countries of any way to feed themselves. The impact of this is huge. I cannot understate this. Millions of people starve. The added impact is that you get distortions that Jordyn was talking about at PM. Because if they thought it was bad that Europeans Europeans were stopping economies from developing by doing bad sanctions and stuff, surely they just repeat that in this world because they don't want their new source of food to go under, so they can't industrialize, they can't develop. The second benefit to the developing world is that when you have investment from Europe in innovation in crops, that benefits everyone else. The kind of innovation we're talking about here is, first of all, innovation in climate-resistant crops, second of all, innovation in water-efficient crops, and third of all, innovation in new farming equipment. This innovation from Europe goes elsewhere because, first of all, a lot of companies operate multinationally, so when they get the benefits of innovation, that goes everywhere they operate. Second of all, proof of concept for future innovation can spread across the world, and third of all, patents eventually expire and can be sold. The result of that is, in the absence of the common agricultural policy, innovation in crops grinds to a halt, and this is important because as temperatures change, we need more resistant crops. And if we don't get that innovation, we don't have any more food for people, an incredibly clear opening opposition.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the debate. Here.
First on Europeans, and then on the developing world. Firstly, on Europeans, we would give you two very clear benefits to Europeans at the top of this speech. Firstly, the average European's life just gets a lot cheaper at the point at which all of the money that the EU spends investing overseas and all the barriers and subsidies that it provides are taken away. The cost of food to the average person in Europe, including people in poorer parts of the European Union, is lower, and those people are benefited. So we think this is actually likely to be a popular policy with most people for that reason. But secondly, that it is just better for farmers. There is probably, to a degree, a lack of choice right now, even in this society of social mobility that tunnels you into being a farmer. But notably, if you listen to our model, we actively increase the amount of agency that these farmers have. We now give them money that is separate to them having to continue doing a grueling and back-breaking job every day, then allows them the capacity to do things like retrain, or if they don't want to retrain because they're like 50 or 60 years old, just live out the rest of their life in relative financial security. This policy is likely to be popular and it improves both of those groups of people's lives. On food security and what opposing opposition says here, 4 responses to this. Firstly, I think you should just weigh the speculative harm of a possibility of food insecurity in the future in Europe against the clear poverty that exists right now in the developing world and the deprivation that has been caused by this policy. So even if you do think there is some food insecurity at the end of the debate, there is clearly food insecurity right now caused by the fact the common agricultural policy exists. Secondly, the only time that European Union farms are likely to fail are instances in which developing world farms are able to outcompete them. We would say those farms are likely to get far better, and the agriculture in the developing world can get better, the point at which there is more money provided to them as well. Thirdly, we would just point out the market is likely to step in where the European Union steps out and continue to do R&D in things like GMOs and stuff like that, because obviously it's still beneficial to private corporations to have that sort of research to make them more money as well. And fourthly, we would just say the European Union is a far better situation because it develops supply chains around the world, which means it is more insulated from any particular weather event that might occur in a particular part of the world right now. Notably, status quo, if there is a problem in parts of Europe that Europe relies on in order to have its food supply, the common agricultural policy means that it cannot particularly easily get in other food or account for the fact that they have a shortage right now. So we say actually you're a better place at the point at which you've developed these supply chains, you're better connected to the rest of the world. Then they say countries will collapse or communities will collapse. I point you firstly to our model where we explain that that is unlikely to be the case. But secondly, the poorer countries in the EU are the most likely to be able to compete with the developing world because they likely have relatively depressed economies right now. So the worst of people they talk to you about are least likely to be the ones that go under. But secondly, I would just posit that if your community or if your region is that dependent on subsidies, your economy is probably just pretty stagnant in the first place because you're not doing anything that's particularly economically efficient or beneficial. We would say it's better to bite the bullet, give these people some money now, and allow their economy to transition away that actually allows them to become prosperous like the other richer parts of the European Union. They then make a claim about geopolitics, but obviously we explained this is actually likely to be relatively popular with the way that we have modeled it in the debate, given that people are actively getting money, but also given these countries are relatively poor, they're likely dependent on the EU to continue providing them that money, therefore letting them stay in the EU further. Jordyn already weighed why that's not that important, but I think we quite convincingly given you a benefit to Europe here as well, so I think we win on that alone. Secondly, on the developing world, as Jordyn explains to you quite clearly, you just get much more money going towards the, agriculture in the developing world, the point at which you can sell for much higher prices than you can in the status quo. You're not artificially restricted from being able to sell things in Europe. It artificially raises the cost, lowers the cost of goods that they are able to sell, or raises the cost of goods and therefore creates less demand. But also, as well, there's just really tough bureaucracy in the status quo. So even when farmers in the developing world have a product that they do want to sell to Europe and it does let some stuff in, they have to deal with the EU's bureaucratic programs, which means, for example, if you're a coffee farmer in Madang in Papua New Guinea, you then have to liaise with the EU delegation in Port Moresby in the capital city. That basically just creates a lot of barriers. So whenever common agricultural policy changes, for example, there are just a lot of hoops and hurdles that people have to go to be able to sell these things as well, which means we just cannot get these goods out in the status quo. And we allow them to get these goods out, even if they don't always sell them for more money, which is obviously likely to do because people in the EU have more money. They're able to just consistently sell it, and it's not changed by the EU's bureaucracy as it is in the status quo. They say, well, this makes a really big harm to food security in the developing world, or global food security. The first thing that we would note is developing countries still have full use of their policy tools in our world of the house, which means they can do things like restrict the amount of food that they're willing to export to the European Union, to therefore continue to provide for their people. And obviously, these governments have an incentive to ensure that famine does not occur domestically, both because they are probably altruistic in that sense, but it also would be harmful for them as well if there are wide-scale instability as a result of that as well. But they can also do things like subsidize local communities so they are still able to afford food. So what this means is you don't have the harm of this global food security exists right now. Notably, that agency doesn't exist right now at the point at which you cannot export this food to the EU. You don't even have the choice as to whether or not you want to export it in the first place, because you have to take whatever money you can get. The other money that you can, the other places you can export are relatively poorer. So you're actually better able to have more food security here because they have more agency over how much food they sell as well. The final thing that I'm going to explain though is the amount of supply that you have is likely to increase massively, but I'll take closing first.
Yep. Since prices are a function of supply and demand, and you say prices go up for sellers of goods and demand isn't changing, doesn't that concede supply of food is going down?
Awesome, about to explain that right now. The problem in the status quo is when the EU diverts all of its money that it has towards farming to producers within the EU, to relatively inefficient producers in the EU who, as we all acknowledge, could not compete alternatively. That means that the farms in the developing world that could be far more efficient otherwise just end up not being a particularly sustainable farms, or farms that are able to do anything with the R&D that the EU actually spends time and money developing. We think the alternative is the point at which you have most of your agriculture going on in the developing world right now, and significantly more money when there is this initial influx of demand from the EU. These farms get a lot more money, the governments get a lot more money, and they're able to reinvest that back into the agricultural programs that exist in those countries in the first place, which means the farms that exist right now in the developing world are not operating at their maximal efficiency. They are doing things as unsustainable farming methods, and that creates, again, problems right now in the status quo for potential global food insecurity when a problem hits either Europe or any of these farms alternatively. But notably, what happens under our side of the house at the point at which you have this influx in money, that means that countries in the developing world can start investing their own money into R&D, to GMOs, and also to improving the environmental way in which the farms operate, which means we expand the amount of food options that exist right now. So they're not only occurring in inefficient farms in Europe and inefficient farms in the global south, they now are just occurring in much more efficient farms that can expand much further and can do much better things. So obviously, I think we solve this problem, or we make it far better under our side of the house as well, but it also means that you avoid the problem that exists right now, where at times of really good conditions for agriculture, you have an oversupply at the point at which you're growing really well in the developing world, but you can't sell it to Europe because they're not accepting it, because they want to support their own people regionally. We say that we would allow that as well to kind of, move around the world as well and benefit here. Ultimately, at the end of this debate, it is awesome for people in the EU. Their life is cheaper. For farmers who otherwise have to do a tough job, they're much better off. But we fix a lot of problems with food insecurity because we improve the way the market operates. That's awesome for people in the developing world who've been historically disenfranchised by the European Union. So proud to propose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech, and to conclude the opening half, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
It's the common agricultural policy that is telling us what types of fertilizers we can use to mitigate the effects of topsoil erosion. It's the common agricultural policy that is funding R&D into feeds for animals so that it produce less methane. It is not just the instrument of colonialism that this opening government team purports that it is. First, I'm going to explain why this causes a massive amount of instability and food insecurity, and probably that they do not properly respond to. Secondly, I'm going to explain why this causes an enormous amount of environmental harms associated with farming practices in the EU and beyond. Let's firstly explain why this causes an enormous amount of instability. The first question to ask here is whether this is an injustice, because open government relies on the premise that many countries have at the moment been locked into being agricultural hubs purely because of the absence of one market out of a set of plausible markets that they could have been selling to, and that now the EU has pulled up the ladder. A few responses. Firstly, the largest of these countries are industrializing rather than remaining agrarian, and it's unclear how much they want to be continue to be locked into being agrarian either. Like if open government are correct and they are set up for agriculture and have a lucrative opportunity to export to Europe for no additional cost, it's unclear why that wouldn't hinder their capacity to industrialize into other comparative advantages instead. They don't even provide an example of a country that this applies to. And I suggest that a lot of these countries that have, you had your fucking chance. Like, the amount of countries that have really large populations, have amounts of agricultural land that they've historically been using, have moved towards, have enormous amounts of rural to urban migration, because being a farmer kind of largely sucks, even if you do it, whether you do it in Europe or elsewhere. Secondly, it's unclear why, in times, as we explained at Lachie, when food prices in Europe are high, why this would not repeat this injustice, why they would not export an enormous amount of that food overseas, noting that it is not local people who are controlling a lot of the agricultural activity there, it is large agricultural corporations who obviously make the most money by exporting it out to Europe, so it's not clear that they get any benefit of that extra food there. Then thirdly, don't even make that much tax money, the amount that this team wants to wax lyrical about how they will invest in local communities, about how they will have support, we are talking about giant agricultural MNCs who bully the governments in areas where they do operate, into concessions, into tax breaks, and do not overwhelmingly reinvest in those types of local communities. Second, those countries that have huge populations largely are having their domestic agricultural stock increasingly depleted by their own population, which is why a lot of those countries have now also set up their own export quotas to make sure that some of that food stays in their country as well. Thirdly, there are other large markets like China, the United States, several large Latin American states, Australia for certain other agricultural products, so it is unclear that upsetting this balance further is an additional benefit, or that a correct balance hasn't been struck under the status quo. Fourthly, it is actually unclear that there is a prima facie injustice here, because they need to actually prove that there is no need to keep some of that farming domestic in order for it to prove that it's an injustice. It's unclear just because you live in Europe now and in the Europe of the past enacted injustices on another country that there is not a legitimate need for you to keep some of your agriculture domestic, right? They actually needed to disprove the existence of that. We proved it at Lachie. The further response that we get is that even though the Euros will allegedly be fine if they stop farming, and that farming is pretty shit and it will therefore be good for their quality of life, they stop doing it, that the only reason they continue to do it is because of an artificially generous subsidies. This is a chicken and egg problem. The reason that these subsidies exist is because farming needs to exist to some extent in Europe, and it is not viable for them to do it in a way that competes with the entirety of the global south. And they don't prove also that these people have anywhere to go if they get university degrees. They've said, well, they can do other stuff. Never attempt to prove why there is space in that labour market, why there is anything else for these people to do million unproven premises. Second, they have less food in Europe, and that causes problems. Or otherwise, an argument titled, yes, food needs to be grown domestically sometimes, a lesson that every single statesman seems to understand, but that this government bench do not. Firstly, because of transport choke points like the Suez Canal, like overland routes that frequently get disrupted by war, like the South China Sea, like political controls in other countries like India, when they enact their own domestic policy to restrict things like rice and wheat leaving that country, like transport costs, which also massively increase the price of food, and like certainty, and like plant diseases, which frequently get spread from one set of crops to another when you move them across border. The problem is that domestic production cannot happen, not because they are uncompetitive and inefficient, but because the wages that you have to pay and the cost of living in Europe, even shittier parts of Europe, are still more expensive than living in many different parts of the developing world as well. There are secondly a series of environmental problems where Europe's climate is frequently too cold or too unpredictable to grow the types of crops that are now understood to be needed to sustain both livestock and human. All of that explains why farming becoming non-viable in Europe is not something that this team can shrug off. The third question to ask here is just to ask, are shocks likely to be becoming more common? And and more so, there's climate change, there's zoonotic diseases that are increasingly common, there are blights and plant diseases, there are geopolitical shocks, there are population demographics that mean that people are becoming less productive, but also growing in number in large other parts of the world. We deal with support this in two ways. We keep some of that food being produced in Europe through those subsidies, and we secondly give enormous innovation to the market in ways that this team does not. And they will not innovate under state government because of the lack of subsidies, because the lower labour costs in other parts of the agricultural market mean that you can increasingly rely on more crude and labour-intensive forms of farming because those labour costs are so low, as opposed to Europe where you do need to try and make them more productive because you can't employ as many people. Thirdly, because it's risky, and if, as this team says, you make more money without actually having to do anything differently because you can just charge more for the wheat and charge more for the rice and charge more for the vegetables, then you will do that. You will not need to innovate, which could be quite a risky thing to do. Closing.
80% of the Common Agricultural Policies budget goes to 20% of farmers. Why is that?
It's because those farmers are ones that would otherwise not be viable, and maybe that is somewhat inefficient. We tolerate a series of inefficiencies in the micro instance in order to support a policy that means that you can have a wide and geographically diversified within Europe agricultural sector. That means that when you do experience a shock, when there is a plant disease, when there are a variety of other things that would restrict supply, like climate, which can vary quite widely across Europe, that you have those fail-safes. It is too important to fuck up. That is why we distribute it in that way. Let's secondly talk about our environmental harms. OD would deregulate this entire sector. I would note that often environmental harms that are caused by agriculture are diffuse, so it is easier to regulate them at a practice level rather than try to just, like as a blunt instrument, curb emissions. And also, the farmers that are dying in their industry are likely to try and squeeze out as many of the productivity of those farms as well. So they're likely to skirt environmental regulations. There are, in the CAP, a series of environmental policies that strictly work to reduce emissions. Like, for instance, diversifying feed sources for animals, subsidising the creation of biofuels, further research into non-phosphate fertiliser to minimise the upstream effects of phosphate mining, and fourthly, things like minimising transport, which account for an enormous amount of the upstream emissions of eating food. There are then, secondly, a series of things that govern other things that are less obvious, like soil depletion that's associated with particular fertilisers, like biodiversity harms from certain pesticides. All of that that's way worse under opening government. They have no way of regulating it. They have no way of pulling it back. Incredibly hard to oppose.
So open up the closing half of this today. Can you hear?
Two things in the extension. First off, why the specific policies of the CAP are incredibly bad, and secondly, why this breeds anti-EU sentiment in a way that is incredibly damaging for the entirety of the world. First off, why are the specific policies of the CAP incredibly bad? I have two policies that I mainly want to discuss about. The first thing I think we've already flagged in a POI is simply the fact that 2/3 of the money that is assigned to the CAP literally goes to direct payments to farmers. The reason why the system is incredibly inefficient, however, is because these payments are scaled not to the amount of production that a farmer produces, but instead scaled to things like land size. And I think that means that OR's benefit is largely knocked out of this debate. It simply isn't true that a massive amount of food is produced as a result of this money, but instead this money is going to areas that are incredibly inefficient. Obviously, this is incredibly bad for a couple of reasons. First off, because it simply is incredibly unjust. Literally 80% of the money goes to 20% of the farmers, but it's not even that those 20% of farmers are producing 80% of production. But secondly, it's simply just a massive waste of money. Obviously, there are better things that can be done with that money, either within other areas of agriculture or simply just going back to their nations and stuff like that. But finally, this is incredibly bad because this is a massive source of corruption and a way in which there are many ways in which this policy can be taken advantage of. That, for example, looks like the fact that 75% of CAP payments in Bulgaria are only going to 100 individuals, and these individuals do not have massive amounts of production, but instead are able to fool this policy by just simply accumulating massive amounts of land. Exact same things that can be seen happening within Italy as well, with the Italian mafia amassing land in order to gain payments. That means that they don't actually produce anything, or otherwise can get away with producing very little. Perhaps they can just skirt the barrier by being like, yes, 1 ton of wheat per this amount of land is incredibly reasonable, but are largely able to get away with this. Secondly, because there is massive amount of opposition to decreasing the use of fertilizer. The specific reason why is because agribusinesses have massive amounts of control control over the cap. It is obviously in their incentive to do so. They can profit billions from things like their fertilizers being used across the entirety of Europe. I will note that this is uniquely possible. This harm is uniquely possible only in a world with a cap. For example, that looks like the fact that COPA and COPEGA, the group that specifically is meant to represent farmers in the EU, has been really easily captured by business interests. That is to say, farmers don't actually get a meaningful vote or meaningful representation within this group. And this specifically happens because there is one centralized body that they need to lobby, like it's just the cap, and then they have access to policy that affects the entirety of the EU, which is a massive amount of money. Obviously, that is far easier than multiple different interests and multiple different bodies in terms of the number of people that you need to persuade, in terms of the number of barriers that you necessarily need to try and skirt, or otherwise the amount of money that you need to spend. This is only happening on the opposition side. But finally, I will note that there are many ways in which corporate interests can be bad. That, for example, looks like the fact that agricultural businesses simply don't care about the environment. That, for example, looks like the fact that they just want more of their fertilizer to be bought, and that thus it is likely to be overused. The soil loses its ability to do things like self-replenish nutrients, which is incredibly bad. But secondly, they obviously profit off of creating a reliance on their goods, which means that they're likely to oversell it or otherwise try and inbuild like certain harms into it to try and create a permanent reliance within this problem. Final thing I want to note within this point is that it is simply incredibly hard to fix these problems. That is to say, you would need to replace literally everybody within the cap, but also everybody within these multiple chains of command across different countries as well that actions out these policies. You would also need to do things like just get rid of all of the previous policy. That direct payment system is where the vast majority of the money assigned to the cap goes, and that is literally one of the largest policies, perhaps the only meaningful policy that the cap has. The other thing, obviously the EU Parliament, I will note as well, or the EU Parliament or the Commission cannot actually regulate this in any sort of meaningful way for a couple of reasons. First off, because this would compromise the independence of the body in the eyes of the public, they wouldn't be able to actually have any sort of change, or even if they do change something in the short term, in the long term, these sorts of forms of corruption are likely to come back into the system. Secondly, because if they do find out something really bad about the system, this is likely to reflect incredibly poorly on them. Countries are going to be far more unwilling to actually donate further money, and that this is likely to affect the function of the other bodies within the EU as well. Finally, because corporate interests are incredibly likely to manifest again in different forms or in different people or in different routes. Obviously, this is true. I think corporate interests have different ways of getting by different barriers and are incredibly clever. This extension is incredibly important because it adds key specificity to the harms that are given by OG, and it therefore shows why farming is going to be done better within the developing world, unencumbered by the specific harms that are rooted within the cap. So, second extension then, why this breeds further anti-EU sentiment. A couple of reasons why. So first off, I'd like to note that I think OG tries to claim this benefit somewhat, but the only reason that they really give is simply the fact that it's super expensive and there's a lot of money. I think that is probably true and feeds into it somewhat, but I will note that there are many other policies that the EU supports, that governments generally support, that are expensive but incredibly popular. That, for example, looks like the fact that there is genuine approval over things like doing welfare during COVID, or otherwise doing things like hosting the Olympics. So I will give a further set of reasons that prove this to sufficiency. First off, there is a decreasing number of farmers within the EU every year, and this is the reason why this sort of need that Oro talks about simply doesn't exist. A couple of reasons why. First off, because these nations are incredibly rich, they can do things like take advantage of free university education and simply choose a different sort of profession. Secondly, because agriculture, even if it does exist, is growing to be less labor intensive as you have things like new machines within agriculture being built. But finally, because of things like climate change existing, people are incredibly afraid of entering the agriculture industry if there are no other alternatives. Because if you buy a plot of land and you buy a bunch of machinery, now you're locked into this industry forever and you have no chance of recuperating. I'll take opening.
The cap is huge in spending and visibility, making it a flagship policy in the EU. Literally everyone who isn't a farmer wants it to be efficient, which explains why your examples are out of date or untrue.
I don't think this is true. I'll give a couple of reasons why later. Okay, moving back to the point though, further reasons why this breeds anti-EU sentiment. Further reasons why, because these countries are incredibly large and rich for the most part, but the large rich countries that donate the vast majority of the money that the cap uses ultimately get the least out of it because they have the fewest farmers. For example, France just produces a bunch of trains and that's what their economy is based off of, but they probably donate the vast majority of money to the EU. Further reasons why, because there are failures of past policy that are empirical, and this is a reason why even if some of these examples might be outdated, they still have an effect on the present voters within the EU. The final reason why is because you're likely to view your own government's policy as being favourable in comparison. That, for example, looks like the fact that if somebody hasn't failed already because they didn't get a chance to do something, then you're likely to hope and view this optimistically, which is the reason why even if this is a little bit silly, a lot of voters are likely to view this favourably. effectively. Obviously, this is incredibly bad because the EU does have some importance in other respects. That, for example, looks like the fact that there are other bodies within the EU, or the EU Parliament and Commission, that does do incredibly important things like regulation of tech, things like negotiating FTAs that are incredibly beneficial and perhaps have an even larger effect than the rest of the agriculture industry. Because the EU as well is so incredibly essential for things like global stability. The reason why this extension gets us over opening is because it's not reliant on winning the opening half deadlock of where farming should be done or is better done. So proud to propose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the member of government for that speech, and I'd like to invite the member for opposition to open the case for closing off. Be here.
The question that the teams in this debate should ask and haven't is, why does the cap exist in the first place? Because as much as I agree that Europeans, and specifically European farmers, are evil demons from hell, I think it's important to note they have the same incentives, they have enormous capacity to act on their political preferences. In a world in which you abolish the cap, what you get is not a glorious neoliberal free trading paradise, it's one where individual countries start doing subsidies, which is massively distortionary, massively inefficient, doesn't actually get any of the benefits of the government bench. That's going to be the extension. So, I'm first going to explain why it is that Europe is likely to want to do protectionism and subsidies in either world. Then I'm going to explain what they do and the impacts of that and weigh it versus around. First reason that Europe is still going to want to do this. Farmers are an extremely powerful political bloc who still want subsidies and protection. They make up 2% of the European population on their own. They are extremely politically sympathetic because they write around narratives like being the salt of the earth. We grow your food. We are the most important people in this country. Without us, the country grinds to a halt. They have lots of capacity to be disruptive with their protests and strikes by being able to drive their machines into the city centres and spray fucking fertilizer that smells like shit all over City Hall. They have enormous capacity to do things like food strikes, and many of them are just independently, for reasons that both government teams point out, quite wealthy. They have a lot of money to do things like lobbying, do things like political donations. They are being courted quite significantly, which means they obviously like protectionism. They like getting subsidized by the government. It makes their lives significantly easier and more luxurious. I'll now deal with OG's explanation in their setup of like, oh, they won't be mad because we'll do this gradually. I would note that firstly, farmers are extremely distrustful of European governments. They are already protesting like babies despite being coddled like babies. Like the Netherlands farmers protest when they went in and sprayed fertilizer was because the government asked them, hey, can you stop dumping fertilizer into the water supply that people use for drinking? These are not people with reasonable demands. They are going to throw a tantrum, even if you do have a slow adjustment, even if you do give them reasonable concessions, which they already do. Secondly, I would note that they have fiat to implement this policy. They don't have fiat to implement it well. They don't explain why the EU is likely to be good in administering this policy. They don't explain why the rate of transition is likely to be slow enough to get people to be happy. And thirdly, I would note that many of these farmers do not have economic grievances. They have cultural grievances, that Brussels is telling them what to do. The globalist bureaucrats are undermining their life, their family, their very culture. These are not things that you can appease by giving people retraining programs in the exact same way that Hillary Clinton offering coal miners retraining programs did not stop them voting for Trump like by a 90-point margin. These are not concerns you can reasonably ameliorate, which is why farmers are going to be incredibly desiring of this. But secondly, I would note even independent of farmers, politicians and the broader populations of these European countries have enormous fears of food insecurity and being reliant on external food. Self-sufficiency is both politically advantageous to promote because as a politician, it shows that you're not vulnerable to a famine. Your grain market is not going to implode the next time Russia invades Ukraine. It gives you autarky over your own production, which means you're much less likely to starve. You're much less likely to be overthrown by hungry people, which is something that means that governments on their own, even if you don't believe all the material about farmers, are going to want to desire, they're going to want to incentivize more production domestically through subsidization. Thirdly, I would just note that many of these European countries, because they're weird and European about it, feel an immense cultural attachment to their food production. That's why France is so insistent that it's sparkling wine if it's from anywhere other than the Champagne region, which is why there is enormous demand to maintain these kinds of protections in the first place, maintain regulations about food and standards, etc., etc. What this means is that the abolition of the cap causes enormous fear in Europe and its governments, even if it is done gradually as OG set up. What do they do in response to that fear? And I know that OO helpfully flag here why huge-scale policies on a national level are quite desirable by farmers and their states. We say they introduce subsidies on the national level rather than at the EU level if you abolish the cap, in order to protect their farmers and their own perceived food insecurity and political points. Obviously, they have the capacity to do this because EU states, even the small ones, have a lot of money because they're relatively developed by global standards. They have access to large pools of EU aid from the past, and I've just explained in the previous point the incentive. What is the impact of them introducing these subsidies on a comparable level to what they would be getting under the cap, but doing so on a sort of dispersed individual national level rather than collectively? Firstly, this massively blunts the degree to which developing nations are assisted by this policy because it means that food prices are still artificially subsidised by these governments, which means that when European consumers are picking between food from their own country or from a developing country, the price point is not going to be a meaningful point of difference. They're going to select on quality and on national pride and on wanting to buy local, which enormously blunts opening government's benefit. Secondly, it is obviously applied unequally because France and Germany are going to be able to subsidise the shit out of their farmers, but Slovakian farmers are going to get owned, which means regional inequality within Europe is likely to get significantly worse. Wealthier countries within Europe gain more power. So if you care about CG's material about intra-European tensions, that is obviously going to make that significantly worse when these countries are directly competing against each other and worsening inequality. Obviously, I think that also is likely to work with some of the kind of corruption that we hear about from government member. Like there's even less oversight on a national level and on the EU-wide level. There's much more capacity for local governments to be lobbied and captured than massive ones with far more stakeholders involved. Thirdly, there's massive opportunity cost because this is enormously inefficient. So you get to take money away from good investments because each state is probably going to have to spend more money individually than it would have if it was done collectively at the broad national level because you lose the economies of scale, you lose the ability to be able to collectively handle that and deal with things, which means that on net, less food is likely to be produced than under the cap, but governments are going to spend more money because it's still politically in their interest to do so. Opening.
Country-level subsidies you describe are illegal under the European Common Market, and even if they were not, it would not be politically possible to take from Bulgarians who live in the city to give to Bulgarians who live in the country, because the Bulgarians who live in the city would hate that. How is this even possible?
Okay, firstly, it's not illegal to subsidise. It's illegal to subsidise to a degree that it distorts the market on a fundamental level. That is obviously it's very easy for these countries. Now they all have this interest not to litigate that in the EU Court of Justice. There's obviously a collective action problem where they all want to subsidise their own stuff. Secondly, I would just point out that city people get screwed over by farmers all the time. That's literally what you're describing happens under the cap. People in Budapest are being forced to pay for Hungarian dipshit farmers to pump fertilizer into the water supply. So, lastly, the other impact I would note is that you lose the common elements of the policy, like the environmental benefits that I already talk about, because there is actually a bit of an incentive to defect and cut costs, and there's a bit of a race to the bottom effect, because when you're individually competing as nations over farming standards, you have an incentive to try and drop them to max, absolutely, boost your production to the highest possible level. I've already explained why this flips CG's extension, because EU countries are now directly competing against each other. Weighing this extension, I've explained why OG largely get no benefit, because they don't activate their principle, because they're contingent on actually making sure that these developing nations are able to be competitive on the price point. We've explained why that is unlikely to happen when the European countries do this. We've flipped CG's extensions on EU unity and corruption, and I think OO's impacts about food insecurity are so heavily mitigated by OG's setup that we're just able to outweigh them, because over a long period of time, you don't get the kind of food shocks that activate their harms, but you do get farmers being evil and doing bad shit, which we prove.
Cool. I'd like to thank the government whip for that speech and to conclude the case of closing opposition, the closing half of the opposition bench, and the final in-round of ABPDC for this year. I'd like to welcome opposition whip here.
Firstly on CG, then on subsidies, and then on food. Let's start with closing government. I just want to make two observations about their case at the outset. The first one is, if you believe their case, which is that basically all the money just goes to very few farmers, and therefore, the vast majority of farmers wouldn't even care if the cap disappeared because they don't even get any money from it. First implication this would have is just to delete OG's case, because their case is like there would be a massive radical shift in the way that the agricultural industry exists, but CG's case says that actually it would be very marginal because most farmers don't even need the subsidies. It's only very few farmers that get the subsidies in the first place. So in a sense, this seems like quite a distinct, like a very kind of different characterization that of open government. Second question you should ask though is, if it is the case that all the money goes to very few farmers, how are they convincing the EU to spend 1/3 of its budget on them if they're producing very little food and there's very little of them, they don't have very many votes? I think all of this explains why it's probably likely that the collective action policy applies to a very large number of farmers and why it has very large impacts in the debate, which explains why closing government's extension just falls out. Let's move on to the issue of subsidies, because this is where closing opposition wins the debate. Sam explains to you that the comparative in this debate would not be just nothing or neoliberalism, it would be states implementing the very same subsidies, but in a worse and less efficient manner. We give you three reasons for that. Firstly, the farmers are politically powerful. Secondly, deep concerns about food security within the EU. And thirdly, cultural reasons. We get four responses to the mechanization here. The first claim we get is that this would be illegal and you couldn't do it. Four responses. Firstly, it is not illegal. It's illegal under the common market to have tariffs between countries, but not for individual countries to subsidize. Secondly, you can look at examples of this. For example, in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, Germany spent $100 billion on subsidizing domestic energy consumption. Or you can look at, for example, the way in which Poland has, for example, subsidized its own farmers. Thirdly, countries frequently ignore the law. Look at, for example, Poland under Pierce, Hungary under O'Byrne, etc. Many countries would be just willing to flout these regulations. And fourthly, even if that was not possible, this would just lead to people electing far-right parties that will flout the law on their behalf. Notably, anger from farmers is what got Geert Wilders into government in the Netherlands. It's what has elected tons of Eurosceptic and far-right parties. So if you believe that harm from closing government, it's far more likely on our side where you piss them off. Secondly, we hear from opening government, city people won't support these subsidies on a national level. Firstly, all the reasons we explain as to why farmers are powerful are reasons as to why they would get subsidies at the national level. Secondly, they actually have stronger interests at the local level for the mechanisms CG gives, which is say if you believe it's the Italian mafia, if you believe it's Peter the Euro in Bulgaria being able to claim access to these monies, they're far more powerful at the national level where they can intimidate politicians, where they often run the politics of the country, than they are at the EU level where these people have far more power and are far more distant from those things. Thirdly, we would point out that they pay right now, so it's likely that at least in the cases where they're net losing money, like France and Germany and all of the largest countries, where they pay far more money because they're funding the common agricultural policy for all states, they'd definitely be willing to subsidize at least their own country. And fourthly, the wealth inequality between nations worsens the harm we identify. So maybe Slovakia can't do it. That is even worse, because it just fucks over the poorest people within Europe while protecting the richest. So that's much worse. The third response we get is to say farmers won't be mad because there's only a few of them and only the richest farmers will benefit. Firstly, that concedes that the people who benefit are the most powerful, most politically connected, and the most able to maintain the policy. But secondly, this characterization flies in the face of logic. If it was the case that no one cared about the common agricultural policy, why has the EU been spending 1/3 of its budget on it since its inception, despite massive crises that mean that the money is needed elsewhere? Despite the war in Ukraine, despite COVID, despite inflation, all of which is cramping budgets and causing massive debt crises across the economy, they're just throwing this money out the window, which no one even cares about? Obviously, that is insane. Finally, they say this policy isn't durable. That logic also applies to common agricultural policy. If they care about the cap, they must also care about domestic subsidies, and they'd be equally durable. And all of the reasons we explain as to why people care about it are true. Note, none of these responses even attempt to engage with all of the other reasons we give you, like the fact that food security is a major concern within the EU, like the fact that there are cultural attachments, which apply not just to farmers, but to all voters generally. That explains why this definitely will occur. What are the harms? It explains that none of government ventures benefits can occur. Because if it is the case that the subsidies are just reenacted, then it doesn't open up markets, then it doesn't allow for farmers in the developing world to be able to suddenly sell their food to Europe when they otherwise would not be. And it means that all of the corruption that CG talks about, all of the hatred of the EU that CG talks about, just reoccurs. It is a less efficient system, so it makes Europeans poorer rather than richer, because they now have to spend money on overlapping bureaucracies and they lose economies of scale. Different capacities increases anger at the EU because the poorest countries are now the ones that have the least capacity to subsidize their farmers, as rich farmers in richer states get ahead, and there is less oversight. So if there is corruption under the Common Agricultural Policy, it gets so much worse. How does this beat out other teams? It explains why opening government's benefit cannot accrue. It explains why closing government's harm of corruption worsens and their harm of Euroscepticism worsens. And it explains why opening opposition's case is just unrealistic because it's contingent on the idea that the comparative would be free trade, as is opening government, and we get up there. Yes?
Your own characterization concedes that your policies are less efficient, less popular, and that they're split on a country-by-country basis, which explains why it is that the developing world on our side can use its agency to push back far more effectively over time and still get the benefits of trade, even if not immediately, certainly in the medium
Push
term.
back how? Doing what? There's no explanation as to how any of that would work. And yes, maybe these policies are less effective, but that is precisely the harm. That doesn't explain how you erode them or how you get over the huge amount of entrenched power that means that these policies exist in the first place. All of these arguments are reasons to believe that the cap should not exist in the first place. The fact that it does is the precise proof as to why these things are true. But even if none of that is true, and you don't believe that subsidies are the counterfactual, why does closing opposition win anyway? We explained via POI that the implication of the government policy is just that less food is produced. Because if prices are going up for producers of food, it must mean that since demand isn't changing, supply must go down, but also subsidies obviously convince additional marginal producers to enter the market. That is bad for a number of reasons that just outweigh any other concern in the debate. Less food for the poorest people means people starve. It means increases in poverty because the poorest people spend the vast majority of their money on food, so even marginal changes in the price of food mean that they're much poorer. It means things like conflict and jihadism in the Sahel because zero-sum fights over resources occur when those resources are far scarcer. And it means things like huge amounts of financial crisis in developing countries who overwhelmingly have large amounts of food subsidies in order to allow people to access food. Think about countries like Egypt that subsidizes bread, or India that subsidizes onions. They're now put under huge pressure when those subsidies have to increase in value because the price of food has gone up, meaning things like the collapse of their currency, meaning they can spend less money on other things. That weighs over the other teams for a second time.
Cool. I'd like to thank opposition whip and all speakers for that fine debate. Across the floor, shake hands, go home. See you all at the break. Good luck for that. Shit, I forgot to turn off the recording.